Howdy, I'm Dr. Jeremy Stoll, and I hate sharing photos of myself. I'm including these here as I discuss Reworlding Comics, a guide to reflexive scholarship. Comics exist within worlds. They are imagined, scripted, edited, reviewed for sensitivity, thumbnailed, laid out, penciled, lettered, inked, colored, printed, bound, distributed, purchased, sold, reviewed, remixed, analyzed, lived, and remade in myriad ways by people in particular times and places. And scholars have an unfortunate tendency to take these complicated and evolving life cycles for granted as part of our own academic labor and lives. In the blog that preceded this presentation, I took readers on a brief hike through an ecosystem of thought with articles, authors, and questions on how comic scholars do the work we do. From comic studies' roots and justifications of the form to considerations of comics labor and reflexivity, I argued for incorporation of personal and production elements. I ended with a question that has gone without answer for the past 5 months, namely, who are we as scholars to lay claim to comics worlds? Or, how do we live up to the communities for and with whom we do our work? I am specifically concerned with the need to reflect on how scholars construct comics as we study them. Through my own scholarship on comics cultures in India, I have found that my peers rarely have much knowledge of major comics industries outside of the US. At best, they might be familiar with certain manga, bande dessinée, European traditions, or famous creators. Accordingly, non-Western comics are often divided into separate panels and publications, even as scholars approach them through the lens of imperialist consumerism, erasing their unique history and context to increase relevance to an American audience. How we position comics and ourselves within comics communities is essential to scholarship, as it shapes the kinds of work of which we are capable. In this paper, I will include reflections on how my creative and ethnographic experiences have shaped my scholarship, but my focus is international collaborations and works from the Indian diaspora that question such divisions and erasure. In the process, I will point to key gaps in comic scholars' methods and argue for a more ethical and culturally conscientious approach, one that requires more of us as academics, researchers, and citizens of a shared world. First off, consider your position. To start, scholars should not step into comics as if exploring a new frontier. Like any member of a society, we work and are situated within social structures, and as explained in the blog post, we cannot responsibly feign ignorance of power structures or our complicity in them. Indeed, it is our obligation to highlight and upend social hierarchies, and the first step is to recognize our own position in them. In other words, what makes us a comic scholar? At its base, positionality refers to where one stands in relation to another person or persons. According to Merriam and Johnson-Bailey et al., this includes interactions between a complex of status variables, such as age, class, gender, race and ethnicity, religion, region, and otherwise. In this view, culture cannot be monolithic, and one's position in relation to cultures is ever-changing, even as it powerfully shapes individual and communal experiences and worldviews. As a scholar, I have experienced a particular positioning of comics in India, based on limited interest in comics worlds from which American scholars are distant. In conferences, my research on India has put me on panel after panel of global and international topics, whether or not the papers connect. In fact, ICAF is one of the few places where my work clearly holds thematic ties to my fellow presenters. The alternative is forming panels on comics in and of India, such as that organized by Professor Mara Thakur with Vartika Kaul for AAS in Asia in 2018, as seen here. When it comes to publications, the field also remains largely invested in national histories rather than emphasizing the ways people inhabit the medium across cultural boundaries. While the number of texts historicizing American comics continues to grow, other regions are often blurred together. Once, I was asked to cover the history of comics in India and Africa in one article, a country and a continent of creative worlds combined for efficiency's sake. Even as a privileged cis-male presenting white American person, I have found my work sidelined as outside the mainstream of comics scholarship. One of the largest issues is a lack of awareness of our own position, an aesthetic bias towards American comics, works designed for us as readers. Thus, excellent comics generally come from what many view as the big three countries for comics, Japan, France, and the United States, despite industries like India having often been among the largest producers of comics in the world. Even framing comics as existing within nations ignores the experiences of creators who cross their boundaries. Creators trained in India regularly gain traction in different cultural contexts, from Amrita Patil's work in residencies and grants in France, these are some of her graphic novels, to creators like Aditya Bidikar gaining renown for their work at American publishers like Image Comics and otherwise. Again, another comic cover for Aditya Bidikar. The lack of awareness of our positionality limits academic imagination, but it also limits who gets to tell history. For instance, the preface to a double issue of the South Asian Review frames the work of graphic novelists like Sarnath Banerjee as an adaptation of a largely American form in the post-emergency era, but ignores the international collaborations that shaped their work. How do we reckon with the author of Corridor, Banerjee, living in Germany, Or fellow graphic novelists from India, Vishwajyoti Ghosh, creator of An Account of the Emergency in Delhi Calm, befriending cartoonists at France's Charlie Hebdo. What about this comic by Ghosh, RSVP, that defies the graphic novel format in being short form and in a different publication format? In not questioning positions, scholars ignore not only their own biases, but the lived experiences of creators, fans, and otherwise. While a production-focused approach can help, scholars often impose terms and histories into cultural contexts where they don't apply. In discussing comics history in India with creator Amitabh Kumar, he used the term mini-comics to refer to a particular era of superhero comics, specifically thinking of the publications of Raj Comics, something that initially conflicted with my awareness of American alternative publishing's use of the term. More importantly, creators are not defined by nationality alone. While folks like Kaveri Gopalakrishnan have traveled to other countries for education and training, many stay abroad for career and community opportunities, like Jasjot Singh Hans, whose acclaimed comics have been well received in the US. Others, like Devaki Nyogi, who's published with Archie Comics, have established themselves as international creators but feel ignored or misunderstood by academics. Positionality requires scholars to reflect on our position in relation to others. In my work, I've had to recognize how Western scholarship often ignores that Indianness is not singular but multiple, and that creators are shaped by myriad experiences and needs. Most recently, several collaboratives are questioning standards for comics in India. For instance, Arijit Sen, Francesca Cotta, and Anisan Gupta's Comic Sense is pushing for stories that move beyond mythology or Hindu nationalism. These are images from their social media where they lay out their mission plan or mission statement. This issue stems from American and Indian scholars who have tended to focus on such stories of the Hindu mythological imagination as clearly literary, clearly Indian, and clearly worthy of study. Questioning our position can help reveal such relations and our responsibility to do better, to focus on these kinds of publications as well. So second, we need to question our orientation. Once we recognize ourselves as situated in a web of social networks, how do we take action? We ought to approach those making a livelihood in comics as experts and inhabitants of creative worlds and question our assumptions about them. In particular, creators generally know that scholars bring in expectations that bear little connection to their lives. I myself have been part of conversations as a comics creator about scholars' overcomplicated terms and theories to make basic points. Is that page layout using the carnivalesque to disrupt diegesis, or is its perspective dynamic? The words and methods that scholars choose have an impact as our approaches shape the field. So the next step is to interrogate our orientation. How do we choose our methods and theories and words? In theorizing a queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed describes the importance of orientation, or thinking about our assumptions. In particular, the theoretical and methodological choices we make shape the work that we do, including things like aesthetics. As Ahmed notes, it shapes the objects and communities. The repetition of work, quote, the repetition of work is what makes the signs of work disappear. It is important that we think not only about what is repeated, but also about how the repetition of actions takes us in certain directions, unquote. Doing work in a particular way, perhaps choosing a theory and an application, shapes the field and the world of comics in which it exists. As scholars perpetuate certain standards of excellence or expectations, such as the value of the graphic novel, readers and creators acclaim work fulfilling those standards. A prominent example of this tendency is Priya Shakti by Ram Devaneni, Vikas K. Menon, and Dan Goldman, an augmented reality comic widely celebrated by global media and scholars. However, in Indian comics worlds, this work has been critiqued for a lack of a grounding in comics and a conception of gender and resistance that affirms harmful Indian nationalism. As media scholars Rukmini Pandey and Samira Nadkarni note in their in-depth analysis, the amplification of this work, quote, by global media networks and private international funding bodies with no access to local knowledge, only serves to further entrench Hindu nationalist ideology within Indian activist spaces. The orientation of media, unquote, the orientation of media outside of India thus orients scholars to Priya Shakti as an object of excellence, but it is simultaneously clumsy in local comics and activist spaces. Positioning ourselves as discovering international works that appeal to us as Euro-American scholars, it allows us to lose sight of their being made for us. We can do better by recognizing and questioning our position and orientation, as demonstrated by Pandey and Nadkarni. Even as they note that the approach in Priya Shakti centers heteronormativity, they shift our orientation by highlighting works that clearly critique heteropatriarchal practices. These include the collaboratively edited Drawing the Line, Indian Women Fight Back, with Ludmila Barch, Priya Kurian, and Larissa Bartonesco, which was built upon workshops for women creators as part of the anthology production process. They also point to the Gacy Zine Issue 4, a queer graphic anthology, edited by Srijita Biswas, Ojaswi Sir, and Priya Gangwani, which centers LGBTQIA+ experiences of Indian culture. Each of these works, as well as anthologies that followed, with The Elephant in the Room, Women Draw Their World, brought forth from the Spring Collective, and later issues of the Gacy zine, emphasizing multiple stories and voices. In so doing, they question a monolithic notion of comics, gender, and everyday life in India. In other words, they disorient us. Much as Ahmed describes queer lives as showing the potential of not following conventional scripts, these local anthologies disrupt our scholarly orientation and the aesthetics that undergird it. Indeed, Priya Shakti shows that our orientations will cause us to focus on certain kinds of work, which then reinforce our orientation. Instead, we should recognize our own lack of objectivity and how our experiences shape our aesthetics. How do we decide what is worthy of study or what is excellent? If we raise up works that appeal to our sensibilities, then we reproduce the power structures that shape and oppress us. Third, ask and listen before action. What is the alternative? My background in folkloristics has trained me that communities should guide scholarship, not the other way around. For instance, during my most recent fieldwork trip, several creators like Rahil Mohsen noted that there is a real need for quality comics criticism in India. While I am less comfortable doing that work, I have shifted priorities from drafting a book manuscript to co-editing a volume of scholarly and creative perspectives on comics of the subcontinent. In short, sometimes we do what is needed rather than what we want to do, and we should be transparent about that. We should be vulnerable and reflexive. The how is complex, but requires us to bring together many strands of knowledge, our scholarly expertise plus the insights and needs of the objects and communities with whom we work. In detailing her work with the Philadelphia Folklore Project, Deborah Kodish gives us a model for redefining our methods. She notes, finding a way to do my job responsibly has required me to develop a kind of Creole practice, weaving together a number of traditions against the folklore theory in which I was trained. I use practices borrowed from critical pedagogy and from critical race studies, habits of addressing power and justice and tracing where bias creeps in, and I use principles borrowed from local people. Beauty is as beauty does, we cannot keep silent, and other sayings that condense the community wisdom that grounds me, unquote. These are only some of the strands on which she posed to weave her approach. It requires the reflexivity and vulnerability that I mentioned in my blog post. In short, comic scholars ought to make our labor visible. For instance, how are we socially and personally implicated? How do our aesthetics shape our methods? And how do we live up to comics worlds? Like Kodish, comic scholar Osvaldo Ayola, pictured here with the author and other comic scholars, describes in I Am Not From Beyond, situating scholarship in the writing eye, how the autoethnographic methods of feminist and Black criticism provide a model for situating scholarship within comics worlds. In particular, he argues that, quote, making ourself and the story of our work part of the work is a way to remain self-critiquing, unquote. Including the personal and the academic can help us situate our work and ourselves within the systemic inequalities that shape both, and work to directly undermine them. When we follow the objects and communities rather than our own sensibilities, we can recognize, as Miriam and Johnson and Bailey et al. Note, that we may simultaneously be insider and outsider. Even if we are a comics nerd, we may not know as much as we thought about graphic novels on the subcontinent, or how mini comics as a term has evolved in different cultures. In brief, we need to allow comics and their communities to be the start of our work, rather than the theories and conventions of respective fields. When we meet on the ground of comics, we can then bring our specializations to the work of maintaining our shared social worlds. In so doing, recognizing our position can help us come to terms with the orientations that shape our worldviews and the vulnerabilities we hide. Bringing them to the surface allows us to exist not simply as academics stepping into comics, but as inhabitants of a community. Similarly, Ahmed explains that orientation shapes how we live in society, noting, quote, bodies as well as objects take shape through being oriented toward each other, as an orientation that may be experienced as the cohabitation or sharing of space. Reflecting on orientations can thus give us the chance to restructure those interactions across groups. In so doing, we reorient ourselves to comics worlds in terms of what scholarship can do for them and vice versa, helping us strengthen each other's position in society. Fundamentally, we need to listen and ask for permission more, not just to analyze, but to be part of comics communities, to see what is happening in these industries and social circles, and to take actions knowing that we should be held accountable. It's not enough to say we didn't know that our work will have an impact. We must act knowing that it will. I have offered 3 action points for living up to the communities for and with whom we do our work. My last recommendation is the answer to the question with which I started. Who are we as scholars to lay claim to comics worlds? We are fellow inhabitants of these worlds, friends, neighbors, and collaborators in taking down exclusionary structures, and we should get uncomfortable. This is not to say that this shift will be easy. This kind of intimacy can be quite difficult. As Dr. Stephanie Rowley and Elizabeth Cole noted in a recent talk, Decentering Whiteness in the Academy, we need change to the academic structures of how we evaluate scholarship and the scholars who make it. In particular, academic institutions enact specific sets of practices that are weighted or conflated with what comics excellence or academic success mean, from clothing to comportment, language, theory, and otherwise. Such standards assume that all have equal access to knowledge of and training in such norms, but we do not. For instance, speaking on a theory panel is a rare occasion for me, and I'm nervous as heck that I'm doing it wrong. This kind of assumption that all have access to the same resources perpetuates inequality by maintaining existing power structures. Not only do Rowley and Cole note that sharing information through mentoring is key, but also that reflecting on our values and goals and how our methods do or don't reflect them is essential to decentering whiteness and undoing the subtleties of exclusivity. As a queer scholar of a different comics culture than much of North American scholarship, it's an unspoken expectation that I sell you on the excellence or uniqueness of non-white and queer people's experiences. I'm asking you to instead prove to these creators that we are worthy of their time. Consider your assumptions based on your particular position. Is that gritty mainstream superhero comic good, or is it appealing to the aesthetic assumptions of your position? Is that international comic an important example of feminist superheroics, or is it perpetuating harmful nationalist notions of heteronormativity? Orient yourself to the work, the people, and the comics worlds into which you step when you do your work. Recognize that rather than exploring new frontiers, you are merely walking into the well-tended corners of a forest built before you came along, and that often the best you can do is to ask others how you can flourish there.